good afternoon, everybody, and hello again. You saw me just a few minutes ago. Welcome. We are now having this press conference called COP28 Litmus Test was success on fossil fuel phase out. And you all know how important this issue is for this particular COP. And as we see the conference drawing to a close, we are not making enough progress. Things are stuck, and we need to push things really, really hard. The COP28 presidency promised a historic outcome, and we are nowhere near that. So we have an amazing panel of from different regions and bringing different expertise who will talk about their own experiences, their own expectations from this COP. And I'm going to invite, so let me just introduce my panel. Brianna Fruin, who is the Samoan climate activist and also fossil fuel treaty champion. Then I have Amos Vimanya, who's from Power Shift Africa, based in Nairobi. It's my pleasure to introduce Brenna Tobias, Indigenous Environmental Network, and she's from the Turtle Island. Then we have Angie Flores, Climate Justice Youth from Earth in Brackets. So Brianna, I would like to start with you, and you bring the experience from Samoa, so you will talk about your expectation and where things are.
Absolutely, thank you very much. Talofa lava, everyone. My name is Brianna Fruin, and I am from Samoa. I want to use this time wisely to amplify the messages coming out from the Pacific negotiators who are holding the line on the inside. They have sent me 3 messages that they want us all to hear, that they need us all to hear. 1, for small island developing states, the global goal on adaptation and the global stocktake are equally important. We are absolutely opposed to the idea that one text can be traded for the other. 2, abatement is a lie. We need phase out of fossil fuels in the text. It is a need and something that we cannot walk away without. And the third, which is probably something that you would hear coming from all the Pacific Islands, is that 1.5 cannot be negotiated for us. It is a matter of survival for our islands. We've said this time and time again. For us, it is 1.5 to stay alive. I can't believe that I have to sit here knowing that my Pacific family in there are experiencing so much pushback on language that had already been agreed upon in the Paris Agreement. Our teams inside and outside are exhausted, but for being fought every step of the way. We are sitting in rooms being asked to negotiate our death sentence, as our Minister Cedric from Samoa has said earlier last night. We are eating in cafeterias next to fossil fuel lobbyists who were allowed to come in the thousands to COP and influence this process. We saw our minister from Niue last night in tears, talking about the draft text. This morning, sitting right here, a longtime Pacific climate activist, Joseph Sikulu, again in tears, talking about this draft text. I have a friend, we just had lunch, he came straight from negotiations, and again, in tears for this draft text. And I want to speak to those tears. I want to speak to those tears because I know where they come from. We are not crying for ourselves. We are crying for our people. COP is not the end for us, nor was it the beginning. Our COP journey didn't start 2 weeks ago. It started in Bonn. It started in the preliminaries. It started in the pre-COP discussions. We've been negotiating this text. We've been asked to fly days away from our islands to come and negotiate text that last minute they scrapped because this is an unfair process. COP is not the beginning, and it's not the end. We have to go home and face the faces of our people, and we have to tell them what the leaders have done to them here today. We have to go and be responsible and hold the burden of the faces of Pacific Islanders and tell them what our leaders have done to them today. How do we go home and tell them the result that the world has sold us out? How do we go home and tell our kids that the world has sold us out? I can't answer that, and I'm wondering if you can.
Thank you very much, Brianna, and that's the perspective from Pacific, and we all know how Pacific nations have been on the front line of this crisis and have been fighting it really, really hard. and they are the ones who are going to be facing the crisis at the same time losing from the way the text has been crafted so far. So thank you, Brianna, once again. I'll now welcome Amos Vimania, who's going to bring the perspective from Africa. He leads the Just Transition work. Over to you, Amos.
Thanks so much. I'm glad to be here, and I would like to start by saying that fossil fuels are not only fueling a climate crisis in Africa, but they are also undermining Africa's development. And we all know that phasing out fossil fuel is feasible. It's feasible because we have renewable energy potential in almost every region of the world to deliver energy access for all. So what do we need here? What we need is the political will and a global plan to be taken by our governments to phase out fossil fuels and usher in renewables. In the history of climate negotiations, I think for the first time we are having a mention of fossil fuels in a draft text. This is encouraging because finally the veil has been torn off fossil fuels. And what this COP needs to do now is to deliver an ambitious decision, a bold decision to phase out all fossil fuels. But rich countries that have developed on the back of fossil fuels need to do so fast and support developing countries to be able to transition to renewables. Rich countries need to stop their gluttony for oil and gas and immediately stop hooking Africa on gas. They need to be responsible partners. In this process, they need to support developing countries to be able to invest in their abundant renewables, especially for Africa, where we still have hundreds of millions of people not having access to electricity. This COP, to succeed, it must put an end to the fossil fuels. And we have seen in previous COPs, they have perfected the game of delaying action. I hope this COP is not going to do so. It must take a decision to end fossil fuels and move beyond dangerous distractions that are hidden under abatement technologies that are destructive but also dangerous to communities. These technologies will require land, and we know what such actions have been to communities and land rights in regions such as Africa. This COP must also set a date to end fossil fuels. It's not just about talking about coal and abated language, but we need a clear end date for fossil fuels. And it must facilitate international cooperation, especially in helping Africa meet its renewable targets and face the cost of Africa transitioning to 100% renewable energy access. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Amos. And thank you for highlighting that equity and finance have to be at the very core of the actions here. Unless we get equity and finance, we will not be able to implement the plans that are emerging here, and that's absolutely missing from the current text right now. Okay, joining us now we have Brenna Tobias, who is an indigenous leader based in the Turtle Island. I would request Brenna to share her perspective.
Thank you, Harjeet. Yat'e, everyone. My name is Brenna Tobias, and I come to you from the Navajo, the Ho-Chunk, and the Standing Rock peoples of Turtle Island. IEN is part of the International Indigenous Peoples Forum on Climate Change, and everybody in those meetings every morning has been talking about how disappointing the language has been, how the negotiations have been failing us. We're very worried about the outcome. We're very worried about the global stock take. And we've been following along when we can. We're in every meeting. We're taking notes. We're trying to hold the line. But what we're seeing is a terrifying lack of progress. The language so far has shown that this process is removing Indigenous people and human rights from the negotiations. It lacks mechanisms to ensure that Indigenous people have direct access to the Loss and Damage Fund, and it will instead be funneled through governments. And what has the US government ever contributed? What have any of these governments ever contributed to indigenous peoples? I'll tell you what they've contributed. Since 2015, $5.5 trillion have been invested in the fossil fuel industry. And how much money was put into the loss and damage fund from the US? 17 million. That's pennies compared to how much of the world's resources are going into extracting these necessary parts of Mother Earth. At last year's COP27, the US climate envoy announced the Energy Transition Accelerator. And we saw this year that he went into what the framework for that would look like. And the framework is false solutions. The framework is focusing everywhere except for the root of the problem. It's talking about how to cut emissions instead of how do we not have any emissions out in the first place. There is no language to stop the desecration of human and indigenous rights. There is no language to stop the desecration of Mother Earth, of the waters, of our very lives. There are instead loopholes for companies to continue displacing indigenous people, to continue poisoning the air, the water, and the land. And all these companies have to do is throw money at the problem. It allows them to continue to grow. 80 years ago, my people didn't have the right to vote. 60 years ago, we didn't have the right to practice our spirituality. And now we're in this space that says traditional indigenous knowledge is important, and yet our rights are violated, and we have to live with the fact that in our backyards, in our land, our people are sick, they're murdered, they're missing, and our rights are being denied. We need to make sure that we have a world left to live in. We have something to leave to our next 7 generations, because at this point, there's not going to be anything. And there's no point in trying to get a return on your investment in carbon markets if you're not even here to see that happen, if you're not here to pass anything on to your kids and your grandkids. And that's where this is headed right now. And I want to really urge everyone who's here and everyone who's listening and all of the global leaders to really think about that and to think about what they want to leave behind, because we're not leaving anything behind at this point. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much, Brenna. Let me now welcome our last panelist, A.N.G. Flores, Peruvian human ecology student and a member of Earth in Brackets. Over to you to share perspective from Latin America.
Thank you, Harjit, and apologies to everyone because of my voice. But I want to start by saying, I want to start by saying that having fossil fuels in the negotiation text is not a victory if it's not paired with principles and actions for justice and equity. And we started badly, because from the very beginning, there was no intention from the developed countries to accept their historical responsibilities. There was a proposal in the GST text dealing with carbon budgets and historical responsibilities, but that is gone now. On top of that, yesterday night, the USA, the EU, Australia, and other countries from the global north made remarks pushing for stronger fossil fuel language in the text, and supposedly keeping the North Star in the 1.5 degree. Although these demands might seem to be what we need, there was no mention of equity or justice in these words. If these countries really mean what they say, they will be phasing out of fossil fuels now, because according to their historical responsibilities and the science, they have to be the first ones making the transition, and they have to do it fast to keep up with the 1.5 degree goal. Secondly, they need to provide finance and technology to the developing countries to phase out too. Without these components, a phase out of fossil fuels in developing countries is not possible. We are already in debt, and we are already paying for the loss and damage of climate change. Without climate finance, there is no adaptation. The phase out of fossil fuels has to be equitable and funded. It has to include a differentiation of timelines and include equity and climate finance. Otherwise, it's nothing. Additionally, the current fossil fuel language in the GST text is adorned with abatement and removal technologies, including carbon capture and storage. These technologies are a distraction, a way to pretend that we are dealing with the issue here when we are not. The unabated language is meant to create loopholes, to continue developing more coal, oil, and gas projects. Additionally, for Latin America, allowing these false solutions and unproven technologies further allows and promotes the perpetuation of environmental injustices, especially in the most vulnerable communities. These unproven technologies delay the real action and responsibility, and a real fossil fuel phase-out has to be false solutions-free. To stand a chance of limiting warming to well below 1.5, we need to pursue a just, equitable, and complete phase-out, backed by finance for developing countries. To have any meaning, the phase-out cannot be littered with false solutions. If these climate negotiations fail to deliver this outcome, it will be the responsibility of developed countries for stripping out of the text the words of equity and justice. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Angie. We will now open the floor for questions. Please introduce yourself. Media first. Can we have questions from media first? If not, please go ahead. Please introduce yourself.
Good afternoon. My name is Reverend Dallas Conyers. I work with the United States Climate Action Network. My question is about the why. A little different tack, and that's the point of it. I've heard equity, I've heard justice, but I haven't heard right. I've heard a strip down of a lack of morality. And I'm wondering what you guys think about purposefully reintroducing the presence of morality, of readdressing the fact that people are dying and that's wrong because we're setting policies that allow and actually purport death in a way that as it's just a number. Death not just of humans, but of ecology. So what do you think about us reintroducing morality as a basis to move political will instead of having everything come down, even equity and justice, to dollars and systems and cents?
Thank you, Dallas. Any other question? Megan, go ahead. Can you have a microphone?
My name is Megan Running. I work for Thomson Reuters. It's a question for Amos. So African leaders and ministers, some of them here, basically argue that they need to exploit fossil fuels in order to have the funds to grow, to develop, especially in the absence of any other support. And that's being used as one of the reasons why they won't necessarily get on board with a fossil fuel phase out unless there's more promise of support. What would you say in response to that? Do you think that's, would you accept that as an argument for not going along with a fossil fuel phase out?
Thank you, Megan. We'll take two questions. Angie, can you respond to the first one?
Yes. Sorry. So, in the negotiations right now, I'm seeing a lot of hypocrisy and dishonesty because, sorry, because when we are already talking about 1.5, it already means that people are going to be sacrificed. 1.5 means the death for some people, and I don't know how we're going to It would be great if we can include the morality, but I see the principles of justice and equity as something greater to hold them accountable. Because right now in the negotiations, I don't see morality and I don't see any sort of transparency. I see just a game, a political game that is full of hypocrisy. And there is a total disconnection between what's happening there and the lives right now in our territories.
Yeah, maybe to respond to your question. One, fossil fuels are not new in Africa. Many African countries have already been exploiting their fossil fuel resources, and it is clear that fossil fuels have not benefited Africa because they have left, like I already mentioned, hundreds of millions of people without access to electricity. Fossil fuels have promised revenue to the continent, but they have left the continent poor. But I understand where those who are saying that they need to be supported for Africa to be transitioning from fossil fuels. One, we cannot expect a country like DRC or, for example, Mozambique to phase out before Canada or Norway. So we are expecting rich countries that have developed on the back of fossil fuels to be able to phase out fast and support African countries to be able to phase out. And for your information, recently, African countries came together and developed an ambitious renewable energy installment capacity, and they are looking at increasing the current capacity from 56 gigawatts to 300 gigawatts by 2030. That needs to be supported.
Thank you, Amos. Any other question? Okay, if not, let me say a few words. If I didn't introduce myself, I'm Harjeet Singh from Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty Initiative and Climate Action Network. There are real big questions about the credibility of this process itself. And the negotiations right now indicate how grave the issue is. This is a place where we were supposed to be seeing a much better text today. What we are seeing is a far more watered-down version of the previous iteration. We had a language on fossil fuel phase-out in the previous one, and now we are only talking about reducing consumption and production. And something that we have been saying right from the day one is the presence of 2,400 plus fossil fuel lobbyists. You can clearly see they had an impact. You could see how the letter was issued by OPEC saying that we cannot agree to the fossil fuel phase-out language. This process has been failing us over the last 30 years. We got a brief mention on fossil fuels at COP26 in 2021, which wasn't enough. We kept fighting for it. Nothing happened last year, and look at where we are. This is the place where we need to get a strong political signal that the world is ready to call for the end of fossil fuel era. But as we sit here, we see that negotiations are happening, and what's going to come out doesn't look like a very strong signal that we actually need that's based on science, equity, and finance. And if that's the situation, we will not be able to avert the crisis, we will not be able to protect the vulnerable countries who have been fighting this fight for decades now. And even if we get that signal, the kind of negotiations that have been happening and the process that we are following is not going to get us, and what Amos was saying, how to actually do that just transition. Even the just transition work program conversations are not enough. That's why we have been calling for a fossil fuel non-proliferation treaty that is complementary to Paris Agreement. Without that treaty, we will not be able to put the issue of fossil fuels right at the center. We are talking about millions of workers who are depending on it. We are talking about countries whose revenues depend on it, and they have not been getting any support to transition away from fossil fuels. And those voices are not being heard, and that's why you see countries like Timor-Leste and Colombia who have taken such a bold step and declared they're going to move away from fossil fuels, but this process is not providing sufficient support. their voices are not being heard. That's the reason we need a treaty which is very different from the process that we are seeing here, where lobbyists have more voice than activists. That's not a space where we can get down to those details. That's why we need to look at what are the other processes that can strengthen this one, make this process more accountable, and actually deliver justice to the people who are facing climate crisis now, and countries and people who are ready to shun fossil fuels and to have a just transition towards renewable and a far more sustainable world. Thank you very much.